Funding for Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery is provided by the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art and the Amistad Center for Art and Culture.
This is Where We Live. From Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Diane Orson. It's a history lesson many of us didn't get in school. Enslaved people helped build much of early New England.
We all have lives. We all came from somewhere. We all own this country. We all built it. It's just that some of us have been left out. And the history that we've learned is only one small slice of the pie that makes America great.
This hour, get to know some of these men and women and the lives they lived. We'll hear from descendants who reflect on their loved ones, from experts and others. It's part of Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery, a special podcast series from Connecticut Public. Visit ctpublic.org/unforgotten. This is Where We Live. I'm Diane Orson. This hour, we're listening to the first two episodes of Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery. It's a podcast and multimedia series from Connecticut Public. We'll be releasing more episodes on Thursdays over the next 5 weeks. You can find all of our coverage at ctpublic.org/unforgotten.
My name is Adrienne Joy Burns. I describe myself as a public historian and a digger. So we're sitting in the New Haven Museum. That's what it's called now. When it was founded in the 1880s, it was the New Haven Colony Society. All of these historical societies are founded across New England, across the state of Connecticut, to uplift the stories of the white people who came here first supposedly, and founded the colonies. And that eclipses indigenous history, that eclipses the history of how any people of African descent came here, whether they came here voluntarily or involuntarily. The descendants and the ancestors were very good at erasing pieces of history that they didn't want us to know about, or at least putting it in back shelves and closets and trunks in locked spaces where we didn't have a lot of access to it. How do we learn about the enslaved people if we don't look for them? And some of the evidence is still in the ground.
Can we look at some of the documents?
Oh yeah, we had them pulled just for you.
From Connecticut Public, this is Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery. I'm Diane Orson.
And I'm Frank Mitchell.
When we think of slavery in the U.S., we don't often think of the North.
Enslavement happened here and has deep roots in Connecticut and across New England.
In this series, we'll hear stories about recovering this history.
And we talk about some of the issues in and around these stories.
Our first story introduces us to researchers and historians who talk about Connecticut's hidden history. But first, Frank, I want to get straight to the big question in this room. You work in visual arts and public humanities. You're focused on histories that have been long ignored by cultural institutions and civic spaces. And in doing that, you've devoted a lot of your life to helping people hold uncomfortable conversations. And I'd like to begin one right now. Who owns this history? Who gets to claim this history? Who should present it? I just want to say that I'm a woman of Russian, Polish, and Jewish heritage, but I'm also a reporter on these stories. Can we talk about this?
Yes, let's try. Certainly there is this legacy of appropriation. Lots of people have anxiety around who owns history because of what seems to have been lost or what truly was lost during enslavement and in the years after around culture and music and identity. And those feelings are real. History is shared. It's not history unless we all claim it and work through it. So I certainly believe that we all have to embrace this history and acknowledge it and recognize it. And everybody has their piece. We all show up in it. It is American history. And it takes all of us investing in it for it to actually give us what we need to move forward into the future.
There's two things that I'd like to add to this. First, my hope is that this series offers a space to open up conversation and open up a closet that in many ways, for many of us, was closed for many years, and to look inside and see what's been there all along. And I hope that this series can join other efforts to help bring forward our story of Connecticut that we long have ignored. The other thing I just want to mention is I stumbled into this through music. In my other professional life, I'm a musician, a violinist, and I was invited to perform a couple of years ago at a church in Essex, and we were told that we were going to play music by a formerly enslaved composer who lived there. And we're going to learn more about that composer in one of our later segments. But the story blew my mind. I'd grown up in New England, in Rhode Island, and I walked the streets and I went to schools surrounded by names and places that I now know are all linked to New England's complicity in this history. And I never knew. I mean, I had zero understanding of this. And I wanted to learn more. And music opened the door for me. And that's where this story begins for me.
It's such a great aha moment. When we think about it, so much of this history is right in front of us. And buildings that were built in the 1700s that used free and enslaved Black labor and are still standing in New Haven, music that is found in archives that people haven't touched in hundreds of years. All these relics are around us. And if we think about it, of course, some of them had to be used and made by free and sometimes enslaved Black people who were in Connecticut hundreds of years ago. Those folks were doing things all around what became the United States. There's no reason why they wouldn't have been here and in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts and in New York doing the same kind of work. And part of the job is to just remind people that, yes, these folks were here and they were doing these things. And if you see something that looks like it was made 200 years ago, it might well have been made by a person, a free or enslaved Black person who was in this country, in this region at that time.
So, Frank, were you surprised when we contacted you to work on this series? And why did you want to do it?
I wasn't really surprised. I feel like we are always bumping into these stories. Someone is always retrieving stories and thinking about what's been missing from the public account of Connecticut's history. And I think back to the bicentennial in 1976, when so many of these stories had this great prompt. And as we approach the 250th, it seems like there are lots of folks thinking about who's missing from the stories we tell about Connecticut. So I was glad to have this chance to visit some familiar stories and to be inspired by some new stories that I hadn't heard before. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for coming on board. And let's listen now to our first story, then we'll talk some more. There's a deeply rooted perception that the North was home to the good guys, the abolitionists. The truth is far different. Slavery existed across colonial Connecticut. Enslaving people was legal here for more than 200 years and did not officially end until 1848. Let's meet several people shedding light on this history and why it matters.
My name is Adrienne Joy Burns. I describe myself as a public historian and a digger, one of those folks who's very fascinated by family genealogy and finding out more about the ancestors.
Adrienne Joy Burns spends a lot of time digging through historic wills, court documents, and church records. She remembers coming across a probate inventory from 1680 for the builder of a home in New Haven.
And on the probate inventory, it mentions things like 3 cows, 5 horses, 2 barns, 1 enslaved Negro woman, and 1 Indian boy. And so that's experiencing cognitive dissonance. People as property in a probate inventory? And the answer to that is enslaved people were considered property, like a cow or a horse.
Burns says we get a very abridged history in school.
They tell us about the famous people. They tell us about the founders. They don't tell us that 20 men, Black men from New Haven, went and fought in the American Revolution. There's no monument in this city that tells you that. So I went in search of Black history, and that led me to the story of enslavement in New England.
It's a story that's not easy to find. In the U.S., we tend to think of slavery as a Southern thing. There are very few reminders around us that enslaved Africans and also enslaved Indigenous people helped build our New England states. Akia DeBarros-Gomes is senior curator of maritime social histories at the Mystic Seaport Museum. She puts it this way.
Slavery in New England has been intentionally erased, the history of slavery in New England. The story we tell is this is family slavery. This person was a member of the family. They helped to support the household. So it comes off as very benign and not dehumanizing, when in fact it was violent and dehumanizing.
I turned to Elizabeth Norman for the history lesson we never got in school. She's founding publisher of Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history.
Let's start back at the beginning. Let's start where most people might think about the beginning of Connecticut. What would you imagine in your mind Connecticut looked like at that time? And I'm going to tell you it's not what you think it was. When in the early 1600s, the first European explorers and then settlers arrived in Connecticut, though it didn't have that name and it didn't have any boundaries, what was here, in fact, was a thriving civilization of tens of thousands of people with a 10,000-year history.
Which helps to explain why the founding of Connecticut began with such conflict, violence, and war, after which there was a lot of work to do.
Clearing those forests, building farms, ships for transportation, etc. So there was a labor shortage. Meanwhile, the English and French colonies in the Caribbean had introduced slavery of Africans.
While here in Connecticut, settlers began to force Indigenous people into slavery.
At the end of the Pequot War in 1637, the captured Pequots were enslaved as war prizes and traded in the West Indies for enslaved Africans and brought back to Connecticut. So that's probably around the time the first enslaved Africans end up in the colony.
And slavery took hold, Akia DeBarros-Gomes says.
There were enslaved men on ships. There were enslaved women and girls working in households. There were enslaved men building roads. It was everywhere.
The colonies established what became known as the Triangle Trade, from the Caribbean to New England to Africa, molasses to rum to enslaved people.
If you think about the triangle that New England was involved in, the Caribbean was a really important center. That is where the sugarcane would be cut and the molasses would be created. The distilleries were in places like Newport, New Haven, New London, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And then that rum that was produced would often, in fact, be used to trade for slaves on the African continent.
Not all Africans in colonial Connecticut were enslaved, but there were very few free black residents. Slavery in the state grew through the 1700s, peaking around the time of the Revolutionary War. In 1784, Connecticut passed a Gradual Emancipation Act and was the last of the New England states to end slavery.
Slavery didn't legally end in the state of Connecticut until 1848. Some would say the eve of the Civil War.
Several efforts are underway now to recover this hidden history. John Mills of the Alex Brienne Corporation began researching lives of the enslaved as a way to reclaim his own family's story.
It's powerful. Oh my goodness, it's so powerful. It's a deeply prideful thing. And I don't know if that's a common thought that a person digging into their life and finding enslaved people would be so prideful, but it is for me.
These are stories of persistence, Mills says, and the history opens doors to a better understanding of our world today. But DeBarros-Gomes says we have to change the way we tell it.
My hope is that by reframing narratives, by validating and honoring Indigenous and Black perspectives, that people come to see history as complex, right? It's not a story of hero and villains. It's a story of systems. Slavery was a system.
And Connecticut was part of that system. Talking about this strengthens everyone, says Adrienne Joy Burns.
If a young person were to say to me, was this history my fault? The answer to that question is no. It was not your fault. It's not associated with you. It neither makes you a good or a bad person. Learning about this history is something that's going to be a benefit to you because it helps us to understand how we got here. And that's the important part. because that's what we can change. We can change it when we understand it.
That is the hope, and there's a lot there. I really appreciate Akia reminding us that this history is complex, and there's so many opportunities to share it, lift it up, and push it out into places where it hasn't been before. And certainly part of that challenge is working through exhibitions and books and school programs, but we probably need to do more. Hopefully, we'll begin to think about what else goes beyond sort of this first round of places where this history is often missing and needs to be seen, whether it's in places in popular culture where it's not normally seen. Every movie you've ever seen that talks about or references slavery in the South. And any dream sequence about it is in the South. There's not, even for something like Scorsese's Gangs of New York, where we see Black people in New York around the time of the Civil War, nobody thinks, oh, they probably were enslaved here and gained their freedom in New York. And so the opportunities to remind people in the broader culture about this history are there for us. And as Akia says, it's complex. There's a lot of work to be done. And some of that really is pushing out into those places where slavery seems to be something that happens only in the South.
That's interesting. You work in public humanities, and you're an editorial consultant for this project. Talk to me a little bit about the role that different people play in doing this kind of work. What kinds of expertise can people bring to this type of research and work?
Yeah, there's so many important opportunities in uncovering this history and sharing it. And as Joy Burns says, being a digger is critically important. Being a public historian is important. It's important to be a curator. Being an expert, and being an expert either on your family history or being a professional expert, is critical. And it's really heartening to see how many folks are doing this work in so many different places. And I think what this series seems to remind us is that there's a role for everybody, whether you're a high school student or a church organist or a museum curator or a history teacher in a high school or an academic historian or a magazine publisher. Some part of this story can touch you and inspire you, and you can get out there and do it. And there are lots of great reminders of folks doing that work around Connecticut, and it is inspiring.
So I'm also interested to know, I was saying earlier, I'm from Rhode Island. Are you from New England? Was there discussion of slavery in the North in your family?
I grew up in Ohio. My parents are from Connecticut. They actually got married in Hartford, and they were headed to a honeymoon in California. They were driving, and my father had a great aunt in Cleveland, and they stopped to see her. And Cleveland apparently was so compelling that they all just stayed. And soon people from Hartford sold their home on Tower Avenue, my mother's parents, and moved to Cleveland as well. And her sisters did as so. We all grew up in Cleveland, which was kind of amazing. And we did hear stories about Connecticut. We didn't hear stories about ancestors who fought in the Civil War. So they didn't go that far back, but we definitely heard stories about Connecticut. And it really was this kind of idyllic place for us. So we only got the good stories. We didn't get the difficult stories, though my mother and her sisters knew people who were doing important work around civil rights and justice and equity in Hartford. And they did mention them occasionally.
And what led you to the kind of work you do? You, for many years, led the Amistad Museum.
I, in undergrad, got to do lots of great programming. And at a certain point, I realized it was easier to teach from objects than it was to just get up and lecture. And spent a lot of time in museums around DC and New York, proving that to myself, that talking an audience or a group through an exhibition where you could point to objects and talk about their significance gave people an opening and space to imagine something that was much harder for them to do in a classroom when you were standing behind a lectern and telling them facts that they clearly didn't want to believe or could find reasons to dispute. And that's sort of what has led me to do a lot of digging, as Joy Burns calls it, and thinking about history in Connecticut and sort of tracking things down and looking for objects that help to tell those stories, because it does feel like having those objects, it's a great prompt to begin a discussion about what could have been and what did happen. And those things make the conversation easier in a lot of cases.
The title of our series is Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery. Would you agree that the story is hidden?
I always wrestle with that. It certainly has been obscured, but I don't know that I'd call it hidden. I think in every town history, or many of the town histories that you touch from the late 19th century, there is a chapter on, in their parlance, Indians and slavery. And they do go through and talk about who lived there and who was enslaved to whom, and an episode of indigenous history from Cornwall or New Haven or Branford or Hartford County. So those stories have been there. And if you're looking for them, they're definitely out there. And so it feels like saying hidden history makes it feel as though it wasn't always there, and it really was.
It was there, but many of us didn't see it. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. There's so many really interesting questions about how Connecticut's history is shaped and how the state changes and how our perceptions change. It's probably for another podcast. It would be great to do that. But I am curious about how we become sort of a more suburban state, having had so many places where people did industrial jobs outside of the cities, how we lost these stories around enslavement and indigenous history, even though they were there. And clearly there's something that's happening in the early 20th century in which we're telling ourselves a different kind of story. And obviously a big part of that is we didn't invest in the kinds of monuments and highway markers and public infrastructure that would remind us of this history and make it part of daily life. And hopefully that's something we can change.
You're listening to Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery, a special series and podcast from Connecticut Public. I'm Diane Orson. You can find more at ctpublic.org/unforgotten, coming up after the break.
We all have lives. We all came from somewhere. We all own this country. We all built it. It's just that some of us have been left out, and the history that we've learned is only one small slice of the pie that makes America great.
Now that we understand who it is we are, what do we do with this, and what's the importance of knowing who you are, it shouldn't be just shame and anger. It also should be a sense of ownership that this is my country as well.
Stay with us. You're listening to Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery, a special series and podcast from Connecticut Public.
My name is Pat Wilson Phineas, and I am the 9th generation descendant of Montrose and Phyllis. Flora would have been my 5th great-grandmother. The poem, Grandma Flora, it was just sort of like an open letter, because I said to myself, what would I say to this woman if I had actually been to Highland House and walked around in her footsteps. But I'll just read it. You were lost to me, but now you are found, just now, in the scheme of time. I have not always known you, but still love abounds. Family love's like that. It seeks to surround. We all have lives. We all came from somewhere. We all own this country. We all built it. It's just that some of us have been left out. And the history that we've learned is only one small slice of the pie that makes America great.
From Connecticut Public, this is Unforgotten, Connecticut's Hidden History of Slavery. I'm Diane Orson.
And I'm Frank Mitchell.
When we think of slavery in the U.S., we don't often think of the North.
Enslavement happened here and has deep roots in Connecticut and across New England.
In this series, we'll hear stories about recovering this history.
And we talk about some of the issues in and around these stories.
In the second story in our series, we'll hear more from Pat Wilson-Phineas. But first, Frank, let's talk about the lives of enslaved people in Connecticut. What did slavery look like in Connecticut? How did it compare, say, with our understanding of slavery in the South?
We have these notions of what slavery looked like, mostly because of what we learned about the South. And there are so many examples that challenge or dispute people's expectations of what slavery was like. In Connecticut and in New England, people did the same jobs that other working people were doing, farming, building stone walls. We have a couple accounts from Venture Smith or James Mars in which they talk about what their days were like and the kinds of work that they did. And it really was the kind of work that you could imagine needing to be done in colonial Connecticut, unless you were in the city where you were doing more domestic chores to keep a fancy or middle-class home going. But even a lot of those folks were doing the kind of farm work that was necessary in Connecticut because of what we were exporting as a state. As people begin to move into freedom, we get different accounts of their ingenuity and the kind of creativity and the kinds of ways that they're putting the skills that they had learned while they were enslaved to use in freedom to build their own lives. But people did pretty much all the jobs you could imagine. And in account books and other people's diaries and ledgers and wills, you get a sense of what life was like. And we do have these really unique examples. I think about Fortune, the enslaved man in Waterbury who became a teaching skeleton. And ended up in the Mattituck
Hold
Museum.
on. You need to explain that. What do you mean he became a teaching skeleton?
He died, and the enslaver turned him into a teaching skeleton. And he hoped to have a medical college in Waterbury. And so the bones moved across generations and then finally ended up in the collection of the Mattituck Museum, where they were on view for a while. And at that point, Fortune was known as Larry the Skeleton, and was a museum exhibit, a beloved museum exhibit. And at a certain point, he went off view, and a research project began in the 90s to track down this history. And it was kind of incredible because there was so much you could learn from those bones, despite the fact that they were over a century old. But there was a lot that was still in them that could be gleaned through lots and lots of research. And the skeleton went to Washington, D.C., to Howard University, where other skeletons that had been found at the African burial ground were, and students got to do work on those bones there, which was kind of incredible. So in sort of what they learned from that skeleton, we got a sense of the kind of hard work that he did, the repetitive nature of that work, probably some abuse that he suffered. There was clearly a sense from the body and from the bones of the life of somebody who would have been the man working to maintain a farm while Preserve Porter, the doctor or the would-be doctor, was trying to build this medical practice.
Oh, my sense is that slavery in the North was the same institution as slavery in the South, but the scale was smaller. And we didn't have plantations with hundreds of people on them. Am I right about that?
Yeah, there were far fewer big farms like that in Connecticut, certainly. I mean, there were a few places where there were multiple families enslaved doing farming work, but most people were living in a household, doing all the chores that needed to be done, they and their family. So Fortune had a family that lived with him at Preserve Porter's. Actually, they had their own little spot nearby. And that's certainly true. That was true for James Mars. You think about Bristol around West Hartford. He had a spot of his own and then goes on to have land. So
I'm naming enslaved people who told their stories.
Yeah, who told their stories, or whose stories we've been able to figure out bits and pieces of thanks to records and court testimony or things like that, who appear in documents. If they aren't telling their own story, they show up somehow in public documents and give us a glimpse of what their lives were like.
Okay, we'll talk more when we return. Let's listen now. In the U.S., we tend to think of slavery as a Southern thing. I recently met with Pat Wilson-Phineas, who remembers spending a lot of her childhood in Connecticut trying not to be noticed.
Because in Ashford, Connecticut, which is where I grew up, was an all-white town except for us. I remember studying every year, it seemed like the Civil War would come up and there would be pictures, and that was me. That was the representation of me to my classmates. I was the living slave. I did not have a context for understanding the richness of my history.
A phone call one day changed that. Wilson Phineas, a former Connecticut state representative, was running for elected office at the time.
I was home from door knocking one day and sitting on the back porch, and my husband came out with this odd look on his face. And he said, "There's a man on the phone that knows a bit too much about you, and I want you to talk to him." And so I was like, well, what? So I took the phone, and it turned out to be a middle school teacher from Guilford who was so excited. And he was giving me all of this information about people that I had no knowledge of.
The teacher, a local librarian, and others were researching the history of slavery in Guilford. They'd read through early court records, journals, and personal papers, and found documents about her ancestors.
We were equally excited because I was like the literal living in to years of his research, and he gave me a family I didn't know that I had.
We're about a block away from the town green in Guilford, a small community along coastal Connecticut. All around us are historic homes and businesses. Wilson Phineas and I are sitting in a quaint saltbox-style house built in 1713, the Highland House Museum. Her family is intimately connected to this space.
Highland House is where my Aunt Candace lived for about 20 years. She is a part of this house, and when I walk around here, I feel her, I connect to her.
Candace was born in 1751, the youngest daughter in a family who were enslaved to a merchant living on the town green. Enslaved people were often assigned first names and not given last ones. Each child in the family was indentured out to neighbors when they were about 20 years old. Candace was indentured for life to the people who lived here.
Candace was both enslaved and indentured. For 12 pounds a year, each of the children was rented out, in effect. So she was rented, if you will, but it was sort of like a life rental.
We're in the dining room where Candace once worked. There's a fireplace and nearby pantry. Wilson Phineas explains that she's a ninth-generation descendant of Candace's enslaved parents, Montrose and Phyllis, who were captured from Africa.
Montrose and Phyllis were two enslaved teenagers who were brought to Guilford by David Naughty in 1727. They were imported, which I thought was an odd word, but it turned out that simply meant he avoided paying taxes because they came in through Boston and he was bringing them to Guilford. But he purchased two teenagers who didn't know each other. The two came over on two different ships, two different ship captains. 3 years later, they were married and began to have children. Naughty died only about 10 years after bringing the two teenagers to his home. He left a will when he died, and in that will, he freed Montrose and Phyllis and their children. They were to be freed, however, after Mrs. Naughty died, and she lived for 30 more years. Mm-hmm. So they were promised freedom, but they didn't all obtain it.
With us in the dining room is Wilson Phineas' son, Cheo Hodari Coker.
These are our ancestors. But the fact that they were property, the fact that they were traded and loaned out like furniture or cars, but so. In a place in Connecticut, in the north. And so when it comes to Connecticut, were you at all surprised?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it's the fact that I could grow up here in an educated community and all of the, the schools that you would expect that you learn whatever you needed to learn. And I learned nothing of myself. I had learned nothing about, enslavement in the Northeast. I certainly had no idea that I had generations of ancestors going back to 1727.
Montrose was freed in 1772 after the death of David Naughty's wife, Ruth. Phyllis died while she was still enslaved. In her will, Ruth Naughty indentured all of their children for life. She said it would be, in her words, much better for them to live in some good, regular, and religious families as servants than to enjoy freedom. Only Candace would live long enough to be emancipated. She married, worked as a spinner and baker, and died in 1826. future generations of this family would include a Revolutionary War soldier, a World War I machinist, a World War II Tuskegee airman who was awarded a Bronze Star, as well as Wilson Phineas, who served as State Commissioner of the Department of Social Services, and Coker, a writer and producer known for the TV series Luke Cage and the film Notorious. I ask what finding this history has meant to them.
Finding that history gave me a sense of ownership and a sense of belonging that, I wish I hadn't had to wait till I was Social Security age to come to believe that I was really an American.
When you're able to look back at your lineage and understand that you have relatives that were not only in Revolutionary War, but in virtually every single American conflict, then you think differently about patriotism. Now that we understand who it is we are and what do we do with this and what's the importance of knowing who you are, it shouldn't be just shame and anger. It also should be a sense of ownership that this is my country as well.
That piece is incredible. It is amazing to hear her talk about being the only one in her classroom and sitting through the lessons of the Civil War and feeling so obvious and exposed. And I am grateful that she has a different understanding of history right now. And I know there are other folks out there who have had the same experience, particularly in courses around the Civil War, and feeling as though they are the only one and they're exposed in a way they don't want to be, and possibly humiliated. Even as we struggle in this country to think about now how students feel called out who are not descendants of enslaved Black people in history courses and in thinking about the Civil War. So it's great to have her voice talking about that from that perspective.
You're Frank Mitchell. You work in the public humanities and you're editorial consultant for this series. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the tools available for people who want to learn more about their family history.
Yeah, there's so much more in 2024 that's available to us to tell these stories locally in what's been pulled out at the State Library and archives around Connecticut, and the continuing investment in trying to tell these stories, as well as digitally and nationally. There are a number of great databases that track enslaved individuals around this country and around the world, actually, and researchers that are doing that work every minute somewhere. So a lot more resources that are online for tracking your family. And sort of the big pay sites have done a lot more to help tell those stories and track people down. And every second day you meet somebody who has sent some of their DNA off to learn more about who they were, and how it either affirms who they thought they might be, and how they're likely to be surprised by what they find as well. So lots of paper documents that are coming online all the time, and a lot more help, a lot more experienced people who have done some of this work who can guide you. And some of those folks are in our state libraries, in our historical organizations and public humanity sites. And so the familiarity with and the enthusiasm for telling these stories and helping to guide people who want to know more is at a much more sophisticated level than even 10, 15 years ago.
There must be some tricky ethical issues around things like DNA research. Could you just touch on some of that?
Yeah, I think the ethics questions of all of this are really profound and fascinating and underexplored. I was struck by sort of the tone in her voice when she said, my husband said, there's somebody on the phone who knows a lot about your family that he probably shouldn't know. You should talk to him. And what it means to have someone have this history and be an expert in your story when it's not you. And when we have the right to share that with people, when we should pause. And all those kinds of questions are questions that we're just beginning to think through and discuss and puzzle around who gets to make that decision and that call, and who do we consult before we go into someone's lives with this knowledge. And
I mean, luckily in her case, she told me this was the greatest gift of her life. But I can imagine that there are very tricky ethical questions around that.
Exactly. I mean, and often it's totally welcome, but sometimes it's not going to be.
Let's just talk for a minute about the passing on of family stories and family histories. For a lot of people, it's just talking to your great-grandmother or something. You know, when people want to explore their family history, where do you tell them to begin?
I do suggest that they think about talking to family members. It is the best way to build that kind of excitement and enthusiasm. And I think more and more people are doing that, like thinking about what do we have right around us. And certainly as I work with folks around building exhibitions, trying hard to source things that are in family collections, encouraging people to go look at old photographs, thinking about documents, thinking about census records, thinking about what's out there that you can easily put your hands on is the first step, partly because it really does, in many cases, build a lot of enthusiasm for the work that's a little harder to do. And if you are excited about what's nearby, you're willing to spend the time hunting for things that where you might have not as much success, or find something that's as exciting as you did in those conversations, or in looking at those pictures, or in discovering that thing in a cousin twice removed's basement.
You know, I was really quite taken by what both Pat and her son Cheo said about this feeling of belonging and how learning more about their family helped them feel that they were entitled to feel that they were part of America's history, part of Connecticut history, part of this nation.
Yeah, you want to feel as though you don't need that permission, but it's really nice to feel like the story goes back multiple generations and that there are those milestones that can be claimed. And to know that you have this connection to the state's history that moves in many cases beyond enslavement or after enslavement, there are other things that happen in your family that you can track to the present. And so many folks don't have that. So once you realize that you do have it, it is kind of incredible.
It's meaningful.
Yeah.
Okay, let's listen now to the poem that Pat Wilson Phineas wrote to her fifth great-grandmother, Flora. She describes it as an open letter.
You were lost to me, but now you are found, just now, in the scheme of time. I have not always known you, but still love abounds. Family love's like that. It seeks to surround. I never felt your pain, but I remember it. You never knew freedom. You never knew a whole life. You had 6 short years to watch your only child grow. He'd live in freedom to father generations. But you could not know. Or did you see? Have you always been there, just waiting for me? Can it be that you've already known not just what was stolen, but how we have grown? Did you watch young Caesar Negro become all that he could be? Were you there when he got the name of those who held him and chose to set him free? Caesar Negro to Caesar Hill. Yes, progress, but yet and still, ownership is not kinship, and kinship was his will. When free, he took his father's name, and Caesar Rogers he became. How Grandpa Sharper must have glowed. Kinship claimed would lift a heavy load. Rogers, our very first family name, allowed us to fend off some of the shame. Claiming it took agency, stamina, and skill. With knowledge of that struggle, I'll honor it. I will. Grandma Flora, did you know that Caesar named his first daughter after you and his second son after your lost brother Abel? Were you there when Abel's daughter Sylvia took a husband and changed again our family's name? Rogers to Wilson, another proud game. Sylvia's son was Alexander. Did you fear his leave from Guilford with only a fishmonger's skill? How proud were you in Virginia when education let him teach at will? Alexander's son William was a teacher too. His son and his grandson both excelled in school. 2 Bertram Wadsworths, a man and his junior. Senior, honored with a science lab after 50 years, he was dubbed the best machinist Goucher College ever had. His son, a fighter pilot, was also my dad. Yes, indeedy, isn't it grand? Your 4th great-grandson flew skies in 3 wars to protect this American land. Were you with him at Tuskegee when he earned his wings? Were you with him in the cockpit doing valiant things? Were you there as he dodged hot enemy metal, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bronze Stars for his valor? Did you watch over him and keep him safe and strong in Korean fields and in the swamps of Vietnam? Were you there to comfort when home from the war, yet again, he faced cruel disdain? Grandmommy, did you know that the sons of all your sons fought in every great war to defend? Did you hope that bravery and valiant service would cure America's hate of our skin? It didn't. Grandma Flora, now I'm a grandmother too, and through these years of struggle, I've lived the things you could not do. You had no early schooling. You never learned to read. The law did not protect you or your precious seed. But now I am a lawyer with 2 advanced degrees. I can right wrongs and help folks get the things they need. And I will tell our story of America to children who can take heed. You never earned money. Me, more than needed to pay my bills. You could never ever vote, but I always, always will. No one called you Miss or Ma'am, and that is such a shame. But when my presence is now announced, the Honorable precedes my name. No one believed that you could think or cared how you might feel. No one needed to respect you or to judge your value real. Your body must have ached all day. You couldn't rest without someone say, the good of your work was not yours for pay. You could not reap fruits from the ground you'd plowed. So very little time to live the life you were allowed. For you there were endless don'ts and can'ts, your future dulled by 1,000 shants. Knowing that your blood courses through my veins, I will concede not ever. Your legacy helps me to embrace your life and times forever. Family love is like that. Grandmommy, thank you for choosing life and for bringing forth the one we all sprang from. I live because of you. Because I live, my son lives, and his children will live to grow a foundation to sustain our family for generations. I take strength from you. The hidden source of strength I've always had comes, I think, from you. Was it the warmth of your smile that I felt on my face as I rose to places that you could not grace? Was it your heart that stoked my resolve when I focused my energy a problem to solve? Was it you that pushed me, reminding with each stride, in part because of you, Black folks my age could glide? We climb the stairs you built. We taste the tears you spilt. We live the life you should have had. We still fight for our skin. And that is just sad. Yet, despite the many barriers, we still work toward the prize. We still fight to defend this land. And yes, we still rise. From every dream that you were denied, I saw dreams fulfilled. I believed, I applied. For every shackled step you took, I rose to achieve, to rewrite the book. Can you know how full the life that I control, how very strong my future? Our family suffers want no more. We've time and funds to nurture. Grandma Flora, for all the years and all the tears, for hopes that never happened, for dreams you weren't allowed to have, I'm unrestrained, path opened. We celebrate the bonds of time, the years you lived, that we survived. Family love is strong and forever. It's with us every minute. Thanks for giving me my life and for always being in it. Your 5th great-granddaughter I am, with admiration and gratitude, a proud and loving heir, witnessing your grace and sacrifice and fortitude.
Next time on Unforgotten.
My dad used to tell stories, but I didn't believe him. The way he talked about Venture was almost like he was a mythical figure. So I had been hearing about him lifting rocks and this big, strong guy. Like, I didn't really think that he was real. And then as we got older, we started coming here.
Thanks for listening. I'm reporter-producer Diane Orson. Frank Mitchell is our consulting editor. Eric Ossen is our executive editor. The senior director of storytelling is Katie Tolarski, and Cassandra Basler is our podcast producer. Editing help from Patrick Scahill, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Dalton. Special thanks to Julianne Veracci, senior director of visuals. A big shout out to our social, visuals, and marketing teams for their support. Vanessa de la Torre is our chief content officer. Our theme music is The Pleasures of Solitude from a manuscript with compositions by Sonny Freeman. Visit ctpublic.org/unforgotten to learn more about the project, including more photos and videos. Unforgotten is a production of Connecticut Public.